All right, welcome back. We are returning for the fourth, right? The fourth
Ooh.
installment.
Is it really that many
I
already?
think so. The fourth installment of the St. Peter's Early and Medieval Church History Adult Ed series.
Quarantine style.
That's right.
Now, I have to ask, what is the pithy title for
The
today's
pithy
lecture?
title. Well, I don't know if there is a pithy title. Today we're talking about St. Augustine. I think Augustine.
Now, is it
gets his
Augustine
own
or Augustine?
title.
I've always wondered what the deal is because I've
You can
heard.
say it either way.
You can say
I've
either.
heard it said that Protestants are more likely to say Augustine, whereas Catholics say Augustine.
So
I don't know if
we
that's
should
true.
alternate being the Via Media.
I actually just say both all the time.
Nice. What I want to know is, why is this angel crying?
That's not an angel. That's St. Augustine himself. And that's him in his garden in Milan.
I thought he had little wings, but I guess that's his robe.
Yeah, that's his robe, just sort of fluttering in the breeze.
I feel like if I were in this exquisite garden in Milan, I would not be weeping.
Well, see, that's part of his story.
Okay.
Is he is moving toward conversion. It becomes an incredibly emotional experience for him.
All right, so everything you ever wanted to know about Augustine, but were afraid to ask.
I don't know if it's everything. What do you know about St. Augustine?
He wrote Confessions and he cried in a garden in Milan.
All right. So far, so good.
Thank you.
One of the things I find fascinating about St. Augustine is that so many people claim to be Augustinian.
Yes.
So your mainline Protestants, Reformed people, followers of John Calvin, followers of Martin Luther, Roman Catholics claim to be Augustinian, Eastern Orthodox claim to be influenced by Augustine.
Sure.
One thing to note, though, in previous weeks we were dealing with Greek-speaking Christians, like the Cappadocian Fathers were Greek speakers. Augustine was a Latin speaker.
Right.
We are really getting into Latin Christianity now when we get to Augustine.
So what does it mean in 2020 to say I'm an Augustinian Christian?
It means a lot of different things. And that's kind of what we're, in some ways, dealing with when we deal with St. Augustine, is one of these incredibly influential thinkers that everyone, even people with diametrically opposed viewpoints,
Wants to claim.
Wants to claim, exactly. Augustine has a lot of moral authority as a theologian, a lot of intellectual capital as a theologian,
Right.
and people want to claim that. But it also has to deal with this concept of original sin, the understanding of the human person as unable to save that person's self, relying on God's grace for salvation, rather than on any kind of internal works.
Right.
That being said, that could mean a lot of different things, right? Catholic would accept that viewpoint, as would a Calvinist, and to some extent also a Methodist as well. Arminians would as well. Though then you get into the whole question about Pelagius and Pelagianism, right? So that's really the reason why so many people want to claim Augustine and claim this Augustinian heritage. And to some extent, every Western Christian is Augustinian.
So, Professor, who is Augustine?
Well, that's what we're going to try to talk about today. A lot of people get Augustine wrong, of course. And for me, when I teach Augustine, when I read Augustine, what I see is a theologian of love. His biggest question throughout his entire lifetime as a theologian, as a bishop, as a philosopher, is really this question: what do I love? Because ultimately...
And is it a question of loving rightly?
That's exactly the question.
Okay.
So it's a question of loving rightly, because there are lots of things you could love. But Augustine's biggest question is, what do I love that will ultimately satisfy me? And that's really what Confessions is about.
I feel like I'm the Vanna White of Confessions.
That's right. This is, of course, Henry Chadwick's translation of it. So it's a lovely, lovely translation. I highly commend it to all. But yeah, the question is, what do I love? And what will I love that will ultimately satisfy me? And the thesis statement, if you will, of Confessions is that our heart is restless until our hearts rest in God. That ultimately there's so many things we could love, but the only thing that will satisfy us is loving God.
I think what I like about Confessions is it's sort of intimacy, and also it's humanity.
Right.
You know, so there are chapters on infancy. Afterwards, I began to smile, first in my sleep, and then when I was awake. It's very human.
Oh, yeah.
I often, before I read Augustine, thought it was going to be some elevated, far distant theological tome, and it's very personable.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And he'll frequently, throughout his writings, whether it's Confessions or his other famous City of God, or in his sermons, many, many sermons, he'll write things like, I myself have observed, you know, for example, you're talking about babies. He talks about, I myself have observed a jealous baby. Or he talks about even comical things that you wouldn't even think would appear in a theologian's writings. Like he talks about a man who can control his sphincter muscles and make sounds out of passing gas, right?
Yeah. Or
some deep cuts in Augustine.
Enjoy a meal of secret bread and drink stolen sweet water. She seduced me, for she found me living outside myself, seeing with only the eyes of flesh.
Yeah, Augustine has just this incredibly wonderful poetic.
And he definitely has wild oats periods.
He does. But so let's sort of talk about that. Augustine, of course, becomes Bishop of Hippo, and he has a lot of opponents. A lot of people think that he is Manichaean still. Now, the Manichaeans were a Gnostic group who very much believed that there was the good creator God, but that matter was created by this evil God. So a lot of people accused Augustine of having this Manichaean sense of good and evil. And in some ways, Augustine is writing Confessions as a response against that charge. But let's sort of back up and go through some of the steps he's making in Confessions and why he might be making them. So in Book 1, he has this opening prayer, and indeed all of Confessions is this prayer. So it's not just an autobiography, it's a theological treatise in a way. It's a spiritual autobiography. He's dealing with a lot of theological concepts throughout. And he talks about babies. And he says that babies are greedy and selfish and horrible. You know how nasty babies are, right? And then in Book 2, he talks about growing up a little bit and becoming an adolescent, and saying that he was at the baths with his father. And his father noticed that he was going through puberty, and apart from being very embarrassing for poor little Augustine, he was aware of the fact that he was going to be a grandfather soon, right? So his father was very happy. His mother, of course, was nervous that he would go on to be, have this wild oats period. Interestingly, he talks about becoming increasingly depraved, and you think, oh, well, he's talking about going through puberty and this wild oats period. Obviously, this is going to get a little bit racy, a little bit steamy. But then he says, the worst thing that I did is my friends and I, we stole some pears.
The great pear stealing.
Right, and he has that famous line, alone I would not have done it. They steal pears. They didn't want to eat the pears. They didn't need the pears. They just threw the pears at some pigs. At first I thought that he was saying that they threw pears at the pigs, but as I read it again, I think he was just saying that they would throw the pears to the pigs, and kind of the pigs would gobble up the pears and they'd sort of high-five each other. So really, the question arises, this kind of adolescent pear stealing.
To shake the fruit off the tree and carry off the pears, I and a gang of naughty adolescents set off late into the night after our unusual pestilent ways. We continued our games in the streets in secret, carrying off huge loads of pears, but they were not for our feast, but merely to throw to the pigs.
Exactly. And he says, alone I would not have done it. And he says, why was it so sinful? Because he didn't need the pears, because it was a completely meaningless act.
Our pleasure lay in doing what we were not allowed.
So, babies, adolescents stealing pears. Moving on to Book 3, his father actually dies fairly young. And so Augustine, who probably would have been a lawyer or something like that, has to provide income for the family. So he becomes a teacher of rhetoric. He moves to Carthage. And while he's in Carthage, he becomes a very incredibly successful teacher. And he loves the admiration that he gets from teaching. He loves the admiration that he gets from speaking well. A professor of rhetoric is somebody who teaches somebody how to talk convincingly. In some ways, he would have been, you could say, a late antique law professor, in a sense, or a late antique political science professor. He's teaching people how to speak to convince people of things, and he's very good at it. It actually becomes very useful when he becomes a bishop later on. But he talks about loving the theater and weeping over theatrical productions, saying, he was weeping over Dido and Aeneas, but he should have been weeping over his own soul. So we're going through confessions. Babies are horrible. My friends and I stole some pears that no one needed, and we threw them to some pigs, and we kind of laughed about it.
Pears are horrible.
I cried at the theater. I was a successful teacher. And then...
I kind of know why this all appeals to you.
And then... and then, in the next move, he takes a lover, a concubine. Let's go to page 53 here. He writes, "In those years, I had a woman. She was not my partner in what is called a lawful marriage. I had found her in my state of wandering, desire, and lack of prudence. Nevertheless, she was the only girl for me," which is like totally Chadwick, right? Like that translation, "she was the only girl for me," was something that only...
It's very like 50s.
Right, exactly. "She was the only girl for me, and I was faithful to her. With her, I learnt by direct experience how wide a difference there is between the partnership of marriage entered into for the sake of having a family and the mutual consent of those whose love is a matter of physical sex, and for whom the birth of a child is contrary to their intention, even though, if offspring arrive, they compel their parents to love them." One of the things that's fascinating about the concubine is he's faithful to her. I mean, today we would call this a long-term committed relationship.
Does she get a name?
She does not get a name. They do have a child, though, whose name is Adeodatus.
Babies get names. Concubines, no names.
But the thing about the concubine that I think is so incredibly fascinating is she would have been of a different status than Augustine. They would have clearly loved each other very much and enjoyed each other's company very much. They were faithful to each other, and legally they would not have been allowed to get married. Fascinatingly, this would not have been an impediment to participating in the sacramental life of the church. If a man and concubine, or occasionally a high-status woman and a low-status man, were in a relationship, if they were faithful to each other, they still could have participated in the Eucharist at church. So here we have, let's go back over this. He talks about babies.
Babies.
Stealing pears. Crying at the theater.
Yep.
Being a successful teacher. In this long-term committed relationship, and they have a child that they love. And he says, "I was so depraved. Wasn't I awful? I cried for milk as a baby. I got involved in some youthful shenanigans as an adolescent.
Selfish.
I was in a long-term committed relationship, questing after truth."
Awful.
I mean, here's this question, right, that should arise. See, a lot of people will take Augustine at face value and say like, yes, he was horrible. He was absolutely horrible. One of the things I always ask my students when teaching this, which of these things is all that bad? Right? He's a professor of rhetoric. He's trying to get you to think a certain way.
Obviously babies are awful.
Babies can be rough. Babies can be very jealous. But
Probably the pears.
ultimately, I think what he's trying to get us to think here is he's not actually that bad. By
just
worldly standards, by our own
question of
standards.
Depravity.
Well, the question is, what is he loving, right? What is he ultimately loving? Are you loving as a baby just the milk or the source of the milk? With the pears, are you just loving this kind of meaningless, completely meaningless act? With the theater, what do you love, right, is the question. His long-term committed relationship. Do you love the person, or do you love the creator of the person? And this is his question that he's wrestling with. Ultimately, the milk, the pears, the theatrical production, the relationship itself are not going to satisfy Augustine. And he's going to keep questing. He's going to keep looking. And indeed, he starts to look a little bit into Christianity. His mother, Monica, is a devout Christian and always weeping over her son, wishing so desperately that her dear Augustine would become a Christian. He starts to look at the Bible, and he reads some of the stories of the Old Testament, and he thinks, this is not the kind of morality I want to emulate. He reads about the patriarchs with their multiple wives. He says, well, I only have one concubine at least. Look at these guys with all of their wives and concubines, right? He looks at King David, right? Is King David a moral example for intellectual Roman? Absolutely not. Augustine's like, that's not for me. Not totally into Christianity. So that's when he gets involved with a little bit of astrology, and he's like, yeah, this is all made up and kind of nonsense. And then he gets into Manichaeism. And again, Manichaeism is this kind of Eastern, Western mixed philosophy where you have this high God, creator of spirit, and the lesser demiurge who creates matter. And Augustine gets really into this as a way of answering some of his deep questions about good and evil in the world. Evil is the product of an evil God, while goodness, the spirit, is the product of a good God. Ultimately, though, he looks at some of these texts, and they're a little bit like Christian Science texts today. He didn't exactly buy into everything that he was learning. And all of his Manichaean friends were telling him, you know what, here's the deal. When Faustus gets here, he'll explain everything to you. Faustus has all the answers. Faustus knows exactly how to explain these texts. And so he thinks, you know what, I'm going to wait. Faustus will get here. And, do we have a visitor? Okay. Faustus will get here and explain everything to me, and I'll understand. Lo and behold, Faustus gets there, and rather than explaining everything to Augustine, Faustus doesn't have the answers. And in fact, he's asking Augustine for Augustine's expertise. Faustus kind of wants some rhetoric coaching. Faustus wants to be a better teacher. So he's nice to Faustus, right? Faustus and him have a fine relationship, but Augustine becomes very skeptical about Manichaeism. It doesn't seem to have all of the answers that he thought it did. At this time, he moves first from Carthage to Rome, and then from Rome to Milan, taking different teaching jobs and political jobs along the way. Very high class, very elite, definitely running in the upper crust of Roman society at the time, definitely running among some of the political leaders of the day. But he hears from his friends that a certain Ambrose, Bishop Ambrose, is a very talented speaker. And he goes to church, he goes to Ambrose's church to hear Ambrose speak. And he goes not to learn Christian doctrine so much as he goes to listen to a talented orator speak. And he says that as he's there, he's listening, and the truth of what Ambrose is saying begins to kind of play on Augustine a little bit. And he goes and listens to Ambrose and speaks with Ambrose. And Ambrose is very kind to Augustine. And that kindness and the ability to speak well and the ability to interpret scriptures in a more sophisticated way is really appealing to Augustine. And so Augustine begins to move into Catholicism. Let's see. So he's encountering Catholicism, he's re-examining Catholic doctrine. At the same time, he's hanging out with a group of very intellectually savvy friends. And this group of intellectually savvy friends are all getting together, debating, talking about, discussing what exactly the good life is, what exactly the good life looks like. And, we could talk about the various trials and tribulations that his friends go through. They're really quite fascinating. We'll sort of skip over it for the time being. But as he's moving back toward Catholicism, as he's moving back towards Christianity, he begins to get involved with Neoplatonic texts. Now, Plato, of course, was a Greek philosopher, not a Christian, lived many years before Jesus. But nevertheless, these Neoplatonic or these new Platonic texts really appealed to Augustine and provided him with some fascinating answers about this question of good and evil. So you'll remember that the Manichees have this sense that evil is this kind of foul, misshapen thing created by an evil God. The Neoplatonists actually had a different sense of what evil was. And as Augustine is looking, he says, I inquired what wickedness is, and I did not find a substance. In other words, there's nothing that is intrinsically evil. I did not find a substance, but a perversity of will twisted away from the highest substance, you, O God, towards inferior things, rejecting its own inner life and swelling with external matter. So what is evil then, according to Augustine, is not a thing. There's nothing that is intrinsically evil. God created the world, and God is good, and therefore the world is good. Evil comes from the will. Evil comes from loving wrongly. Evil comes from loving the creature rather than the creator. Evil comes from loving a thing as an ultimate good rather than a lesser good created by the highest good. So that concept of good and evil then is going to be very satisfying to Augustine, much more so than the Gnostic sense that evil is the creation of an evil God. Augustine has this sense, no, there's nothing that is evil. Everything is good. And evil actually comes from loving things wrongly. This he finds very consistent with Christian ideas about good and evil. His concubine is sent away at this point by his mother, and he's betrothed to a woman who's actually underage, a girl in essence who's underage, which would have been very common in Roman society at the time. And the match was set up by his mother. His mother was hoping to have him married to a fashionable, appropriate spouse, even though he very much loved the concubine and clearly had this committed long-term relationship with the concubine. In those days, marriages were only between social equals. Even if love was absent, an appropriate match, and even if there's this incredible age difference, an appropriate match was between social equals and not necessarily two people who cared about each other. And this is one of the big questions he has with his friends. Can he give up a life of sex? That's the biggest question that he starts wrestling with while he's moving toward this final conversion experience. He reads about the Desert Fathers. He reads about Antony. He reads about the sort of ascetic withdrawal of all of these people. And that's really where he begins weeping. He really begins weeping over the fact that he doesn't think that he has it in him to do what it would take to make him ultimately happy, to commit himself entirely to God. So that's where he goes through this large stage of weeping. He has this analogy a bit earlier on of a beggar. The beggar is in a gutter, drunk, sort of smiling and mumbling to himself. And he says to his friends, look at this guy. This guy has this momentary happiness, and he's sitting in a gutter. Whereas me, my entire life, I've been striving for excellence. I've been working really hard, absolutely hustling every day of my life. I sit around crying and worrying about what the good life is. And look, here's this beggar who's sitting in a ditch, who seems to have much more happiness than I've ever experienced. What is going on here? Why is it that that beggar has happiness and I don't? What is going to make me happy? And so he's in a garden and he's weeping and he is absolutely distraught. I heard one theologian say, Sproul, he was going on about the conversion of Augustine, saying that he was just finishing a night of carousing. That's actually not true, right? Augustine is not carousing at this point. Augustine is desperate to take that leap into an ascetic Christian lifestyle, but he's terrified that it's not going to make him happy. Nevertheless, he hears this voice. He's crying, weeping, distraught. His friends actually get kind of embarrassed that he's weeping so loudly, and they kind of walk away and let him have a moment by himself. He's distraught and crying and weeping, and he hears this sing-songy child's voice saying, "Tolle lege, pick up and read, pick up and read." And he picks up the Bible, and I should have marked this beforehand. Let me see if I can find the passage. He picks up the Bible and he opens it. He interprets this tolle lege, this pick up and read, as a divine command, this very famous line from Confessions. And he picks up the Bible and he opens it, and the first passage that his eyes look at comes from Romans. And it says, "Not in riots and drunken parties, not in eroticism and indecencies, not in strife and rivalry, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh in its lusts." I neither wished nor needed to read further. At once, with the last words of this sentence, it was as if a light of relief from all anxiety flooded into my heart. All the shadows of doubt were dispelled. And Augustine at that point really does sort of take this leap, this ascetic leap. And a lot of people have commented on the irony of the fact that here's a guy who has absolutely everything. He has a great job. He's had a great relationship, and now he has a great marriage prospect. He has everything that a Roman man could want. He's got great friends. He has a villa that he goes to and talks about philosophy. Ultimately, none of that makes him happy. And he then takes this leap into a life of renunciation. It's only giving everything up that is going to make him truly happy. So that's this fascinating paradox that Augustine is acutely aware of, that sometimes it's only in giving up the things that we think we need that we actually find ourselves truly happy. This idea is going to be fundamental to the medieval understanding of the monastic life. The good life is a life of renunciation. The good life is a life of service to God and also to neighbor. The good life is not a life of personal fulfillment, constantly getting more and more and more, but renunciation. It's important to note it's not total renunciation, right? Nothing is evil. Nothing is intrinsically wrong. Things, however, need to be kept in their proper place. Things need to be loved as creations and not as ultimate goods in and of themselves. A lot of people accuse Augustine of being overly negative about the flesh, overly negative about sex, overly negative about the earthly life. This is where they accuse him of bringing in some of his old Manichaean ideas into the Christian religion. And to some extent, there might be some fairness in his criticism, in this criticism toward Augustine, but ultimately he would claim that nothing is evil, nothing is wrong, it just needs to be loved rightly. And sometimes when something becomes so all-consuming that it's dominating your life and getting in the way of loving what is ultimately good, then it actually becomes a stumbling block for you. So this is his kind of complete conversion. He and his son Adeodatus are baptized by Ambrose at Milan, and he and his mother Monica have this incredible vision, kind of ascent into heaven at Ostia shortly before she passes away. And ultimately, he returns to North Africa to set up this community of Christian philosophers who are going to join together in Christian asceticism. In North Africa, he's passing through the tiny town of Hippo. And Hippo is desperate for some clergy, and it's desperate for some good clergy. So they sort of press Augustine into ordination. Here's a guy who is living the life of a priest, who is not using his gifts and talents to serve the church. So a whole group of people say, Augustine, we want you to be our pastor. And he says, absolutely not. I don't want a life in church. And again, he's always crying. He starts crying. And it's only through, he talks about his ordination through this veil of tears. And that's in 391. He's born in 354. And now he's in his, I guess, his late 30s. And he's ordained at Hippo. And at the age, it looks like here, just based on my math, of 41, he's consecrated as bishop. The bishop in Hippo didn't want Augustine to go to a different diocese, so he decided the best way to get him to stay here would be to make him the co-bishop of the diocese. And really, as bishop, Augustine moves from being a philosophical Christian predominantly to a pastoral philosopher Christian. The pastoral element becomes a major focus in Augustine's life and work. And as a pastor, he has a number of huge theological debates and church polity concerns to deal with. The first one I'll talk about that is really important is his struggle with the Donatists. The Donatists at this point were about 85 years old, and they grew out of the old persecution against the Christian church by Emperor Diocletian. When Diocletian was persecuting the church, a number of Christians gave up texts. They gave up the sacred texts to the Roman authorities. Sometimes Christians would give up the wrong texts because the authorities couldn't read, and very frequently they would wind up burning, I guess, the equivalent of a Sears catalog. Nevertheless, a lot of Christian leaders did give up texts. A lot of Christian leaders did stop conducting worship. A lot of Christian leaders did renounce their Christianity. These were called the traditores, the traitors to the Christian faith, the Christian tradition. After the persecution ended, a number of these leaders were welcomed back into the church. And there was a question, to what extent are these leaders legitimate leaders? Cyprian wanted to take a very hard line against the traditores, the traitors, whereas Pope Stephen took a much more lenient line toward them. The Donatists took an extreme position after Cyprian, whereas the Catholic Christians followed Pope Stephen. And what you get is this split in North Africa in particular, between the Donatists on the one hand, who take a strong line against leadership that had anything to do with apostasy, and Catholic Christians on the other, which allow the traditores to have some sort of reconciliation with the church. It comes to a head when the Bishop Caecilian was consecrated by 3 bishops, one of whom was one of these traditores. The Donatists thought that this was a step too far, and they sort of broke communion with the Catholics. So you have this battle going on between Donatists on the one hand and Catholics on the other. It doesn't help that a number of these Donatists form marauding bands and attack Catholic churches from time to time. It doesn't help that Catholics use their position of imperial influence to try to put down the Donatists. Every hurt along the 85 years has been remembered. They have various martyr days where they remember a Donatist who might have been killed by a Catholic or vice versa. So this is kind of one of the big church struggles that Augustine steps into. Against the Donatists, Augustine and other Catholic leaders would claim that the church is not a pure institution. The church is always a mix of clean and unclean, just like Noah's Ark was always a mix of clean and unclean animals. They also talked about the universality of the Catholic Church. Donatists were located in North Africa, whereas the Catholics had fellowship with the church in Rome and throughout the world. There was a universality of the Catholic Church. That's what Catholic means, is universal. And finally, at the Council of Arles, what is that? Arles? I don't speak French, so maybe somebody can correct me. Arles. In 314, it was decided that it's not the priest, the moral quality of the priest that makes sacraments effective, that would make ordination or baptism or the Eucharist effective. It's the rite in and of itself. The whole ex opere operantis, the idea that it works because of the quality of the operator versus ex opere operato, that it works because of the quality of the ritual itself. Ultimately, though, the Donatists remain a presence in North Africa, and Augustine begins to come toward this position that the state, which is officially Catholic or officially belongs to the sort of more universal sense of the church, ought to use coercion, ought to use punitive measures to get people back into church. At first, he's very skeptical of this idea. At first, he's very skeptical of the idea that you should use coercion to bring people into church, because then you'll have a lot of false converts and that can create more problems. As his career progresses, he comes around to this idea that Donatists ought to be penalized in some form. There were minor, not necessarily minor, but there were sliding financial penalties put on Donatists depending on their financial class. So a wealthy Donatist, for example, would have a fairly substantial penalty, whereas a poor Donatist would have a lesser penalty, financial penalty. So he comes toward this position that the church can use, or the state coercion, or some form of coercion, in order to bring people into the church. Jesus has the parable of the banquet, where the king invites people to the wedding banquet, but the people don't come. And so he says, go out into the street and compel them to come in, compel the uninvited to come in. And he takes this idea of compel them to come in as a sense that compulsion, coercion, can be used in the service of truth. The state can compel people to do things in the service of truth. This becomes increasingly problematic through the years as the church gains more power. This idea of compelling them to come in takes on a much more nefarious standpoint with things like the Inquisition. And it's only really at the Protestant Reformation, some of the fallout from the Protestant Reformation, that this idea of compelling people to come into church becomes increasingly problematic. It's one of the persecuted French Huguenots who will write a long treatise against this reading of compel them to come in. The French Huguenot is going to say compulsion can really only be through reason, through argument. It can't actually be through any kind of state penalty or physical violent penalty. All right, so that's the first major conflict, is with the Donatists. The Donatists, by the way, will survive as a persecuted group up until the rise of Islam, when both Catholic and Donatist Christians are swept away from North Africa. Next, he is dealing with the charges of a number of pagans. So Arian Vandals, right? Arians believe that Jesus was the first emanation of God and not necessarily co-eternal with God. Nevertheless, Arian Vandals attacked Rome in the early 400s. And a lot of pagans said, look what happened. In 380, we all became Christian, right? Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and now Rome is being attacked. Obviously, our gods are mad at us, and they're mad because we've abandoned them to the Christians. Augustine writes City of God against the pagans, against the charges of the pagans, as a response to this claim. He comes to a few answers against these charges. First of all, he wants to say there is no purely religious state. Augustine, while he believes that you can use coercion in the service of truth, he's not going to say that there is a purely Christian state. There's always a divide between church and empire for Augustine. And that's very important for later political thinking, especially when we get to this idea of separation of church and state. Of course, the way we think of it was very different than the way Augustine would think of it. Nevertheless, there is no purely Christian state. Instead, you have what he refers to as two cities. The city of God, which is defined by the love. Remember, he's the theologian of love. The love of God to the exclusion of love of self. And then you have the city of man, which is defined by the love of self to the exclusion of God. He wants to say that these two cities are not actual places on earth. The city of God is the coming kingdom of heaven, while the city of earth is really where we're all living now. The church militant, the church on this earth, is not really the city of God, because remember, it's a mix of good and bad. Society, broader society, can't be defined as just all bad, because again, there's a mix of saint and sinner in society. So you can't really claim that there is a purely religious state in one place and not the other. So ultimately, good and bad are mixed together. And therefore, you can't really claim that because we've converted to a different religion, our gods are angry at us and therefore have swamped us. The Christian gods are the wrong gods because bad things have happened to us. Augustine wants to say, well, Rome is part of this much larger arc of salvation history. It belongs to God's time and is not the end-all be-all of human existence. The other thing he wants to say is that in so many ways, Christians actually preserve the common good and therefore cannot be said to be bad citizens. By worshiping Christ, people have a sense of the greatest truth. They long to serve the greatest good and therefore are really important, or I should put it this way, because Christians want to serve the greatest good, which is God, they will be natural servants of lesser goods, the common good of the state. So it's wrong to charge Christians with bringing down the state when in fact Christians are seeking to preserve the common good of the state. Some important aspects of this. Because you have this mix of good and bad, you can't really tell where God is at work. God is at work in wider society, God is at work within the church, and it's only at the end of time that will be able to see very clearly who is who belongs to the city of God and who belongs to the city of man. Therefore, Augustine takes a line against harsh judgment of people who are on the outside, because it's not entirely clear how the story is going to end. Those who are on the inside may in fact wind up on the outside, and those on the outside may wind up on the inside. Ultimately, all of these decisions belong to God. As I say this, you can probably hear a lot of similarities to later Protestant ideas about irresistible grace, later Protestant ideas about election. And that's why a lot of Protestants have claimed an Augustinian legacy. Nevertheless, Augustine has a very strong sense for the institutional church, a very strong sense of the church as the bride of Christ, and as the ark of salvation. It's for that reason that Catholics have really claimed Augustine Augustine as a church father. All right. And the final thing I'll talk about here, the final important piece of this, is the discussion here of Pelagius, Augustine's arguments with Pelagius. Pelagius was a British monk. A lot of people have commented he was sort of the first British theologian who took a real exception to the idea of original sin, on the one hand, that we all share this, the sin of Adam and Eve, the sin of humanity. And on the other hand, he took exception to this idea that we're saved by grace. For Pelagius, that is sort of a cop-out. Pelagius wants to have a strong sense for moral responsibility, the responsibility of the individual to act rightly, to act according to God's plan. Augustine, of course, famously defends this idea of original sin over and against Pelagius. Grace for Augustine becomes incredibly important, and it refers to God's saving activity in the human person. The human being cannot save the human being's self. Works are not ultimately going to save a person. This is something that both Catholics and Protestants will agree on. How exactly works and faith go together in the process of salvation, that is something that they'll disagree on. But nevertheless, Augustine is going to take a strong stand that because of original sin, there's nothing that a person can do to save themselves. Salvation belongs to God, not the individual. So ultimately, therefore, Pelagius's ideas are excluded from Catholic orthodoxy. Pelagius, in a lot of ways, is referred to not so much as a Trinitarian heretic or a Christological heretic like we saw last week, but much more sort of a soteriological heretic, a heretic who doesn't necessarily understand, or you would say from the official position, who kind of innovates a salvation based on human activity rather than God's activity. This is one of the reasons Augustine's strong stand on original sin here is one of the reasons why so many later Christians are going to claim that you cannot save yourself. This becomes very important for the Western theological tradition for both Catholics and Protestants. And they'll often hurl the charges back and forth at each other of being Pelagian or semi-Pelagian. Reformed people in the Reformed tradition and Methodists are going to hurl charges back and forth. A lot of Reformed people will claim that Methodists are semi-Pelagian because of the Arminian theology. Nevertheless, all of these Western Christian groups share a very strong sense of original sin. And original sin is often viewed as this incredibly negative, oppressive theology. And certainly it can be used in that way. Nevertheless, I think one of the real important things to note with original sin is that we are all alike sinners. There's no one who's better or worse than somebody else. There's an equality that comes from this sense of original sin, this equality of this fact that human beings are created good, they have this inherent dignity, but nevertheless, because we all have original sin, we all have the capacity to love the wrong thing, we all have the capacity to turn away from that goodness. The other thing that's important to note about original sin is that it means that no aspect of our lives, no aspect of our being is incorruptible. No aspect of who we are is beyond turning away from God. None of us is perfect. Nothing about us is perfect. Nevertheless, nothing about us, our nothing that is imperfect, is beyond the possibility of redemption. And that is very much this Augustinian sense as well, that in spite of original sin, we are not beyond the pale of God's saving activity. Original sin, this strong sense of original sin, also creates in the Western tradition a real emphasis on infant baptism. Augustine himself was not baptized as an infant, as is clear, and that's largely because in the early church there was this strong concern about post-baptismal sin. When you have this sense that we all share original sin, however, you want to baptize children as quickly as possible. And then the problem of unbaptized babies arises. To what extent can you say that it is just for God to condemn to eternal damnation an unbaptized infant? Augustine has two solutions to that problem. In the first place, he suggests that the unbaptized babies of pagan parents can't be held ultimately responsible for a sinful life. They certainly will be punished because they have the mark of original sin, but they'll have a lesser punishment. This becomes the idea of limbo, a place where unbaptized babies and righteous pagans go in the afterlife. It's kind of like heaven with a few more sighs. It's kind of like heaven without ultimate happiness. The other solution that Augustine comes to in this question of unbaptized babies is the baptism of desire. The idea that if the parents wanted to have the baby baptized, but the baby passed away before it could be baptized, then that would count, that desire of the parents would ultimately count as a baptism. This same idea is currently being applied to this idea of spiritual communion. The fact that we can't get together in church and share in the Eucharist right now has created this space for people to talk about a communion of desire. We all wish we could be together taking the sacrament, and there's this spiritual reality that precedes the actual taking of the Eucharist. So Augustine, ultimately, what do we sum up with when talking about Augustine? First and foremost, I would say, and ultimately really, Augustine is a theologian of love. The question to focus on with Augustine, reading Augustine and coming away from Augustine, is what do I love? Do I love something that is finite? Do I love something that will pass away? Do I love something that will not endure? Or do I love something eternal? Do I love something not only eternal, but ultimate? Do I love something holy? Do I love something complete, or do I love something incomplete? Do I love, in another way of phrasing it, do I love the creator or the created? And for Augustine, anything less than loving the ultimate is going to leave you completely dissatisfied. So ultimately, that's where we will conclude with Augustine, this question of love. What we'll see is Augustine is opening the door for medieval Christian society to develop out of the last vestiges of the Roman Empire. And in some ways, you could say that Augustine is this pivotal character. He dies in Hippo during a barbarian invasion. The Arian Vandals had made it into North Africa in 429, and he was besieged in the city and died before the Arian Vandals could get into town. And in some ways, Rome itself was being overrun by these Arian Vandals and by these outside barbarian forces at this time. The Rome that was the Holy Empire was falling apart. You have the last vestiges of Roman Empire in the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines referred to themselves as Roman up until the very end. But nevertheless, what we're going to see is the birth of medieval European society growing out of the fall of the Roman Empire. And Augustine is going to provide a roadmap for how to build this medieval European Christian society. And that will be the topic of future lectures. So until then, I wish you all a very good week.